Hi, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to the second conversation in our Supporting Veteran Success on Campus series, which is hosted by Columbia University's Center for Veteran Transition and Integration, CVTI. For those of you familiar with CVTI, you know that we are focused on the issue of transition from the service, from military service into education in the workforce. A nationwide center on all sorts of issues. And today we're talking about an issue that's sort of near and dear to my heart, recruitment and admissions practices, bringing veterans to campus, to your campus specifically. Hopefully we have a lot of higher ed professionals out there who are joining us today. I'm Curtis Rogers. I'm the Vice Dean at Columbia University School of General Studies, Columbia's college for non-traditional students. And home to a large population of student veterans, one that we're incredibly proud of. And I am privileged, quite frankly, to be joined today by Catherine Hill, Cappy Hill. Cappy is an accomplished economist, the former president of Vassar, and the managing director of Ithaca S&R, and who has incredible experience in higher education across an array of functions and issues. So we're going to talk about admissions for veterans across higher ed, and just jumping in. Cappy, you know, my perspective, I hold the title right now, Vice Dean, but I'm also the Dean of Admissions. So, you know, I've spent a lot of time sort of on the ground doing recruiting and going out and going to bases and interviewing veterans. You've had a number of different roles, including running an institution. And I think, you know, there's overlap in how we think about and care about this issue. But I'd just love to start with a general question. Why is this important?
Yeah, so, well, first of all, thank you for having me. I'm so delighted to be here. You are doing such great work at Columbia and at the center as well. I engage with Beth Morgan often and just have respect for everything that both of you are doing. So I got involved in this issue really when I moved to be president at Vassar, and I arrived, and the institution was an institution that was committed to making a great education available to students for whom it wasn't traditionally available. So if you think about, Vassar was a former women's college. It was founded by Matthew Vassar to make the kind of education that was available at Yale and Princeton and Columbia and Emerson Williams for men, but not for women. And so it's been part of the institution's DNA for a long time. And when I got there, it felt like it was not as diverse as it wanted to be or talked about itself being. But there was a real commitment to make it so. So we started thinking about ways to do that. And we kind of doubled down on thinking about socioeconomic diversity. And then when the Yellow Ribbon program came into being, we looked at it and said, well, this makes perfect sense. We should be recruiting and offering admissions to veterans. They're a group of young men and women who deserve a good education. They deserve the kind of education we're offering. And we should make a place for them here at Vassar. Now, the interesting thing was we signed up for the Yellow Ribbon program, and of course we had no veterans in our applicant pool. So for a year or two, you know, no luck on that front. So then we really dug into it and thought about different ways to have a bigger impact on this population and try to get veterans to come to campus. And just really quickly, when I think about why is this important, I think it's important for the individual students, because getting the kind of education that we offer and an education where you're likely to graduate is incredibly important to that individual and their families. I think it's incredibly important to the institution to have a community that's very diverse in terms of backgrounds and life experiences, because I think the learning environment is much stronger with that. And then finally, I think it's incredibly important to our society and our country that veterans get to take advantage of the GI Bill benefits that they've worked incredibly hard to have access to and to use them in an effective way. So I'll stop there. for now.
That moment you mentioned, 2008, 2009, 2010, when the post 9/11 GI Bill sort of worked its way through Congress, with the Yellow Ribbon program as part of it, was transformative. And here at Columbia, at the time I was, sort of immersed in admissions. We were watching it closely. We had already been doing some work in terms of building a veteran community in the sort of years immediately following September 11th. Large numbers of service members being deployed overseas, and recognition that the service members come home, and we, institutions of higher education, admissions offices, admissions officers, we need to be thinking about what does that return look like. And we started to do a little bit of work in the space, and started to reach out to bases and do recruiting. And I'm sort of fortunate where I sit because I work at this school that was founded in 1947 because of the first GI Bill. So it was sort of a moment we were built for. But when that bill came through, and it really sort of harkened back to the spirit of the original bill. It had the resources needed for service members to access education without the barrier of cost. That was an enormous moment. And I think it did a lot to sort of accelerate the conversation across higher ed and get institutions moving in a good direction. But today, right here we are, that was 12, 13 years ago when that happened. We're now under the forever GI Bill. That support's still there. We've had troop drawdowns, withdrawals. The environment's changed a little bit. What are the implications for where we sit today? You and I had the chance to talk a little bit leading up to this, and we had a conversation, and you said something about being hopeful, and I was really struck by that. Today, being hopeful. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of noise in the space. There's a lot of challenges we're facing, but you're hopeful. I'd love to dig into that because I love the concept.
Yeah. So when we first started thinking about bringing veterans to campus, and then did it, and it turned out to be just so kind of exciting for everybody. I mean, I think our faculty who weren't quite sure how this was going to play out were just incredibly excited to have these young men and women in their classrooms, and we're seeing the benefits to the dialogue that was taking place on campus. So I think it's a really good thing. It didn't take on. I thought like every school around the country would start doing this because it's just such a good idea, and it's come a lot more slowly than I thought it would, but in the last, say, 5 years, I'm seeing much more attention to it on the part of institutions, with their recognizing, as I said before, that these individuals deserve this kind of an education, that it benefits the rest of the community, and that it would be a really good thing for our country right at this moment. So I'm seeing more commitment to it, and more institutions saying, this could be a good path to take, and it could be a path that could help us meet some of our other goals and mission. So I'm hopeful. The other thing is I think we've learned more, and you could talk about this too. I think at first when we started doing this, I thought all the constraints were on the institution side, and it was just if we could get these institutions to say and recognize the benefits of getting veterans problem solved. It's a lot more complicated than that, but I think we know a lot more now. I certainly know a lot more now than I knew a decade ago. And so as institutions move to do this, I think there are more pathways to support the work that they want to do. And so I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, it is a lot more complicated. One of the early lessons I think that quite frankly, I was surprised by, being, again, dean of admissions going to a military base, was the sense that I got when I talked to some service members, and I'll share a story that I've shared frequently over the years. Walking into an education center, sitting down with a Marine, and being told, I can't go to your institution. I can't get in. I'm the dean of admissions, and they're telling me they can't get in, and I don't belong in a place like that. And so, there has been this barrier, and this is something that at CVTI we're really working on and thinking about. How do we kind of get rid of this idea of, I've referred to it as the soft bigotry of low expectations, this sense that, I can't go there, or that people are telling service members, veterans, they can't go to a place like Columbia when we have hundreds of veterans enrolled in our undergraduate classroom. So those barriers, that's one of just a few. They're real, and so it's not just institutional willingness. It's a variety of things. I do think those things are they feed each other, right? We as institutions of higher education, 10, 15 years ago, especially the highly selective institutions where I sit, where you have been, I don't think we always conveyed a message that is as hopeful and optimistic as it is today.
I think that's right. The other thing that's really interesting about this, that we could substitute other groups into the conversation we just had. When we started both at Williams and Vassar looking to recruit lower income kids and kids from, more socioeconomically diverse backgrounds, it was the same kind of discussion. The first thing was, well, of course they want to come here. And then all of a sudden you figure out that that's not the case. Like, they don't think they belong. They think they might be uncomfortable. They also don't have some of the information about complicated things like financial aid or federal benefits to know that it's even affordable. They look at a sticker price and say, I can't possibly afford that. And they may even have a college counselor, not to critique college counselors from under-resourced high schools, because they may be trying to take care of 500 students, and it's just really hard to know about all the options that are out there. So it goes both ways. Schools have to want to go look, and they have to convey the information and convince students that not only are they able to take advantage of these great schools, they're talented, they can succeed, there'll be real benefits if they come, and that we want them, and they should give it a try. We can come back maybe at some point and talk some more about, it's not just getting students in, it's making sure that they succeed when they get there, and that takes a whole bunch of other things, many of which were talked about in the first episode of this series, but we can talk about those as well.
Right, and maybe a good topic for the third episode.
Yeah.
And one we should spend more time on. But you sort of tiptoe right up to something that's been, I'll admit, a bit of an obsession of mine for most of the time I've been working in higher ed, and certainly the time that I've spent working with student veterans, changing the system and getting rid of the sort of systemic barriers that exist, whether it's, the support that is provided by the DoD and the VA in terms of, transitioning into education or the workforce, and sort of making it just part of the process when you leave the military, that from an education perspective, we're figuring out, how do we match up a student, a veteran, a service member's experience, ambition, potential with the right kind of institution, right? And all of these things have to work together. Institutions have to be willing and have to be committed and have to make an effort, the same way we make effort to go out and recruit students from all kinds of places. We have to do that with service members and veterans. We're seeing that more now than we used to. I don't think we're seeing it enough yet. I hope we see it happen at greater scale. I still think there are barriers, but we're seeing the door cracked open a little bit. But there's so many other places that need attention, right? These, ensuring that transition is considered early on in service. I mean, we know what sort of the sort of funnel looks like. Lots of service members coming in, and only a small number continue on for a long time, especially with enlisted women and men. So most of those individuals will eventually exit service. And when they exit service, there's a responsibility we have to ensure that that transition is successful to whatever it is in the right way, right? That could be education, that could be the workforce, that could be an institution like Columbia, it could be other institutions. Oftentimes it's the 2-year school first before it's the 4-year school. And that the system does that in the right way. My experience, unfortunately, has been, but I do think this is important for people who may be listening here, because I've seen it so many times. It's that individual they encounter along the way who says to the service member, the veteran, you should look at such and such place because I know you can do it, or I know that's the right place for you. It's a beautiful thing that happens, whether it's a commanding officer saying that, or it's a family member, a parent, an employer, whoever it is. But we've gotten away with that for too long, because that's been the way it's happened. Here in the early years, even when we were out recruiting on basis, if I put 20 top student veterans in a room, and I asked them, how did you get here? It's going to be that story. It's going to be someone told me I should go, not the system got me here, the process got me here. And so I'm sort of obsessed. How do we fix the process?
Yeah, I completely agree. And again, I think across American higher education, this notion that we don't do a very good job of matching up students to appropriate institutions is really a systemic problem across higher education quite generally. We have an array of type of schools that go from community colleges with pretty limited resources on one side, working really hard to serve a population, to our selective institutions that have great resources for a variety of reasons, and tons of scaffolding to support all students who come through the door. But we're not necessarily matching up students across those array of institutions in a systematic way to make sure that those students who can really benefit from these different types of institutions are matching well. And so we do have to figure out how to fix the system, because it can't be one-offs. And because there's so many institutions, at Vassar, I think we had maybe 10 admissions officers. We couldn't go to the bases. We didn't have the expertise or the person power to recruit that way, which is why we partnered with originally the Posse Foundation and Warrior Scholar Project and Service to School to act as an intermediary to help us identify veterans who would benefit from the education that we offered. I do think we need to get more information to active military so that they can plan. And that's proved to be really hard, because there's so many things that they're being exposed to along the way. And they don't, when they're got many years left, they're not focusing on what they're going to do when they get out.
Right.
When it is time to focus to leave, they've got an awful large number of things that they're focusing on. And the folks that are helping them with that, don't necessarily have the expertise on how to think about the appropriate matching on the education side. I do think technology is going to help us there. And I think if we can figure out a way to have a few places where, now the proliferation of that access to information on the internet is a problem, because it's then hard to sort out what's good information and what isn't. But if we can figure out a way to get trusted information to active military so that they can plan a little bit about where to go. The other thing that we have to do, and I think this is really important, veterans often do start at community colleges. They may have had a high school experience that didn't prepare them really well to go on to one of these selective schools. So their high school record, which is what most admissions officers look at as they make decisions about admitting 18-year-olds or 19-year-olds, it's not going to work in the veteran space. So having some community college credits where you've demonstrated that you're ready now, you are college ready and you're talented and smart, and this would be a good place for you to go. The problem with that is that many of the selective privates actually don't take very many transfer students.
Right.
So part of the structural change needs to be that these institutions also just decide that they're going to take more transfers. And I think that this is another place where I'm hopeful. the demographics of our country and the enrollment numbers are looking like we are approaching a little bit of a downward pressure on that. And that's going to encourage schools to think about other populations of folks who want to go back to higher education and get a degree. And the transfer pipeline is going to get more attention as a result of that.
Right. There's so many points that you've just made that I think are really important. For a moment, I just want to comment on the actual admissions evaluation piece of this. And again, from the perspective, thinking about it from a dean of admissions perspective, when you go in and you evaluate someone for readiness at your institution or a contribution that they might make to your institution, and I'm doing where we are, Columbia School of General Studies, a college dedicated to non-traditional students, but fully integrated into the undergraduate program. So the admissions calculus on our end is evaluate students who bring to the application experience in life in addition to those academic measures, but put them in a classroom with students who come to us directly from high school who are some of the top students in the world. So it's an intense environment in that particular way, that the expectation for a student who steps in the classroom is that you step into the classroom ready to be a student on the same level as any other student in the classroom. But one of the things that we've learned is that evaluating readiness, evaluating preparation, and even more importantly, evaluating the contribution one might make when they get to the classroom, that experience matters. And for service members, when you look at that application, you think about the time, I have found it to often be transformative. And I don't say that as a moment in time transformative. Sometimes it is. And I've had many applicants who spoke to a moment that they in service that kind of pushed them in a direction. But I'm not talking about that generally. I'm more talking about the application of discipline to what is potential and intellect, and finding that during service, and that we as higher ed professionals and admissions professionals very specifically have to look for that. We have to want to look for that. If we're beholden only to those traditional measures of academic success, how good is your transcript in high school? Are you straight A's in college? If we're test optional at the moment, lots of institutions are. What are your test scores? Or if you don't have them, what are the other things? How strong is your essay? If it's just those things and you don't take seriously what experience does to transform one's ability to be a serious student and to have a contribution to make, then you're kind of missing most of the students in American higher ed, right? We know something like 75% of the students enrolled in American higher ed are non-traditional by some characteristic. Enlisted service members, by and large, fall into that category when they exit service. And so, for me, thinking about it as an admissions professional, I loved to understand the experience in service, and to look for students to say in their application essays or in interviews, which are very, very important in a robust admissions process, a holistic admissions process, especially at a place like Columbia GS, to be able to speak to how something has prepared them for what they want to do next. And I think that's a lesson for the institutions as they're looking at this more directly and thinking about this. Well, how do we do more transfer admissions, and how do we ensure, the big revelation in all of this is the students who come through this process, our non-traditional students, are some of the top students we have across the institution generally at the undergraduate level. They are superstars. They're contributors in huge ways. And it's not what they just, what they get out of it. It's what the 17 or 18-year-old sitting in the classroom gets out of having a student with life experience, service to the country in this particular case, sitting there speaking to that as they engage with the issues of the day. That's sort of the value in it. It's incredible. It's transformative for the institution, but you got to be willing to dig in there and not just be stuck on, is the record perfect? And quite frankly, is the record perfect 10 years ago? Is that super relevant today for that person? You have to ask yourself that question. You have to look for the factors that are, what indicates this person's ability to do well and thrive in the academic program today, not what they look like in high school. And that's why that service experience matters so much.
Yeah, so I've come to think that what we use to make admissions decisions at these selective institutions for the 18-year-olds needs to be reconsidered at exactly the same time, because if these institutions have become very wealthy, they're very selective. Lots of students are smart and they know they want to go there because these institutions have lots of resources and wonderful opportunities if you can get into these schools. And we have a set of criteria for admitting them that I think in some ways are kind of odd. Is a perfect high school record a really good indicator of somebody who has lots of talent and creativity and initiative and perhaps willing to take risks to do something really exciting and different? We know that before optional test scores tend to be highly correlated with race and income. So we think they're important, but they're proxying for, race, white, and high income. Are those the students who are going to benefit most from what these amazing institutions have to offer? And these are institutions that receive very large subsidies from the federal and state and local government to serve the public good. And we should be asking which students should be in those seats at these institutions to best serve the public good. Now, you don't want to bring students in who can't do the work and, thrive in the classroom, right? But I'm not sure the criteria that we're using to reject students are rejecting students who aren't going to thrive in the classroom. And I think these veteran students have proved that. They come in, they're committed, they've grown up. Maybe they weren't there at age 18 to go on and be successful in a competitive university, but they've learned and grown and become committed to a pathway. And again, I go back to they benefit from it, the rest of the institution benefits from it, and our country benefits from allowing better matching for these young men and women who have served the country by serving in the military. So, right. But now the real trick is that it's hard to do, right? And yes. It's actually pretty easy to screen on things like a high school transcript and scores and even a reference letter, although I would argue that those are also correlated with who's writing it for you. And if you're in a small private high school, a whole lot of attention goes into that reference.
Right.
Now, admissions officers can take that into account, and I think they do try to. But, the kind of admissions that you're doing and the kind of admissions we were doing for our posse of veterans is very labor intensive. And so it's hard.
Yeah. Well, I for a moment, there's this piece of the conversation, and the kinds of students that we're talking about in highly selective, more traditional admissions environments, and the sense of how we evaluate them. There's this piece of this that I look at, and it's a strange thing to think that, it's not a criterion in our actual admissions evaluation process, but by default, because of who we look at, it becomes one of the criteria that we use. You have to have stayed within your cohort. You have to have, and what I mean by that is you have to have actually managed your educational process almost perfectly if you're going to the most selective institutions in the country. And if for some reason you've fallen off of that path, or you've chosen to move off of that path because there's also choice involved. You're then put into a different category, right? If you're not, so you haven't managed the system right, and then you're not within the same cohort, and then you're different in the process, and then there's no path for you to allow you to get to that more traditional place, because the only thing we're looking at is, have you managed your cohort and your educational experience in the way that we expect all of our applicants to do that? And we, I think it speaks to your point. We've got to get away from that, because why are we ignoring students who are many years out of high school, students who can make a contribution? Do we only want to educate at the most highly selective institutions those who are 18 to 21 years old? Or do we think it's important to educate all of the students who have talent and potential to be at institutions like that? And we know, having done this work and brought students into our classroom who don't fit that mold, there are contributions to make. We have to make an effort to get there. But you're right, it's hard. It's a challenging thing.
Yeah, and if you fall off of that traditional pathway and want to go back to higher education later, the pathways that are open to you are at institutions that have significantly less resources. And so if community colleges are working unbelievably hard, but if you started at a community college and want to get a bachelor's degree, only about 13 to 15% of students who started at a community college who want to get a BA do so in 6 years.
Yep.
And they have fewer resources to work with. It's hard to get a BA if you started at a community college. To be honest, if you go to Columbia or Vassar as an 18-year-old, it's hard not to get a BA, because there's so much support, because there are lots of resources. You've got a really good chance of actually getting that degree. So, I personally think it's incredibly important that these selective schools open their doors more broadly to a diverse set of students, including, importantly, veterans, as they did after World War II, for all the reasons we've been talking about. I think also, just for America, what we need to do is get more resources across all institutions, so that if you start on a different pathway, you have more support and ability to get through, because we're not going to solve it by having all of these students make it into the selective schools. They're not big enough. So that's the other part here, which is we've got to improve it for everybody, so that if you do start at that community college, that you have a higher chance of actually succeeding.
Right. A number of years ago, I think I had shared this with you in an earlier conversation. I used to go to do sessions, and I would go to various bases, and I would do a Columbia information session, a Columbia admissions information session. And I was, early on struck by, I'm talking to a group of people, and the system is not supporting them in the right way. They're not thinking about education broadly. They've come to this session, and maybe what I really need to talk about is just college admissions.
Yeah.
Because and it's something that you just said, which it so resonates with me. It's not about getting to Columbia for everyone, or it's not about getting to the most highly. It's about getting to the right place, the place that matches you up with what you want to do and the potential you have, and maximizes that. And that's, that could be a range of institutions. And that's the thing that we have to do well. And some students, that is a place like Harvard, and other students, that's a different institution, or it's the workforce. But we don't do most of it well, which is the big problem, right? So there's change afoot, right? I mean, there's reason to be hopeful. If you look across institutions, and certainly in the post 9/11 period, and then with the onset of the post 9/11 GI Bill, you've seen enormous progress in terms of veterans and access to education, and even more recently, real progress among highly selectives, which is wonderful to see. Declining high school graduating class sizes through 2025, a big case in front of the Supreme Court right now for affirmative action, which could have an impact on this. What this moment is, I feel, sort of like we're on the edge of some additional change. I'd love for your thoughts, as someone who's stewarded an institution as the president, and in what you do now, which is working with a whole range of institutions on issues like this. What does this all, mean for us? What could happen with over the next few years as we go through some pretty big changes?
Yeah, so I think there are a bunch of different pressures. So enrollment's going down. We've also had 40 years of increasing income inequality in America. It's gotten a little better over the last, I think, 20 years, but still is bad over that longer period. And what that has meant is that even those declining number of families with high school graduates over the next few years, they're coming from predominantly low and middle income families. So the selective schools that are mostly recruiting higher income students, that pool's getting smaller and smaller. And so I think institutions are going to need to think about where we have these wonderful institutions. We have great faculty across a wide range of institutions, and we need to match up students with them. And I think so that's one thing. The second thing is this affirmative action case in front of the Supreme Court. I think everybody is expecting affirmative action either to be eliminated completely or pretty heavily constrained in some way. And I think most people are thinking that it's just going to be declared unconstitutional. So institutions that have been committed to a diverse student body are going to have to think of other ways to accomplish that or give that up as part of their mission. Again, I hope that they won't do that, that what they'll do is think about different ways to sustain that commitment to diversity. And they have a variety of tools to do that. And one of them is to look at the veterans population, which tends to be first gen and more diverse than their traditional 18-year-olds. And then the important thing about the veterans is that they also come with federal money. They come with the GI Bill. You could fill your class with lower income students to make up for what's happening with the demographics, because they've been going to school and succeeding at lower rates. So they're another pool of students that you can recruit from. But they need a lot of financial aid to succeed. And at the selective schools, that's really expensive. And schools will spend as much money as they can on that, but it's not an infinite source of resources that they can devote to that. So veterans bring GI Bill money with them. At the flagship publics, tuition is paid, and then these students have a housing allowance as well as a book allowance. At the privates, we're more expensive than the flagships, but with the Yellow Ribbon program, you can get pretty close to covering about 70% of the cost, which is significantly more than you would with your average financial aid student. So I think there's hope there.
I agree. It is a moment for hope. I want to play devil's advocate for a second, though, and ask you a question without pushing the boundaries too hard here. But I am interested in, so if what is happening right now and what we've seen with highly selective institutions being a little more proactive in the space and welcoming more service members, and there are pressures and reasons to do that, as you've just described, in a period where we see a change in the other direction, what do we think? Do we think that this will stick? That veterans will continue to be sought after and finding homes at places like this? I mean, some of the publics are doing this. I mean, they've been doing this really well the whole time, right? Yeah. So, and I've often said, sitting here at Columbia, where I think we've done a good job. I think we've tried hard, but let's not be too self-congratulatory about what we've done when other institutions are doing it equally as well. And let's keep working and let's keep doing better. But the question I ask is, post 2025, when we start to see increasing graduating class sizes, and maybe the landscape is settled a little bit after the case coming down the road at the end of in June. How do we think institutions will react, and will they stick with it? And what can we do to encourage that to be the case?
In the last 5 to 10 years, confidence in our country's institutions has declined across many types of institutions, but that has included higher education, and particularly the selective institutions. They're getting kind of attacked from both the right and the left, and from public policy makers within both the federal government and the state. And I think we collectively need to think about how can we serve the public good better than we've been doing. It's been kind of a ride to get increasingly selective and get increasingly more resources to do what we do and do it better and better. But I think it's time to sit back and say, how are we using those resources to benefit our country at the moment? And that's really important, because if we lose the public's support, bad things could happen to us. So I do think that this is a moment where it would be important for us to ask that and try to contribute to solving some of the problems that we're facing. And I do think that admitting veterans does that, because it's an issue that both the right and the left are passionate about and care about. And we should care about it for the same reason that they do, but it would also be a good idea for us to do that.
Right. No, that's a really important point. I also hope, and I experienced this, firsthand over 25 years, working here at Columbia and working in this space in various ways, that when you open the door and you give people opportunity and they show what they can do, you come to realize how important it is to have them in the classroom. And that's what happened with service members here. When we were in the 20 or 30 students, getting to the 480, we had at, our largest number of student veterans enrolled. It was those early students who were just doing amazing things. The phone calls I was getting from faculty members saying, this is the best senior thesis I've ever read. And you get a little bit of that. And that's what I hope is happening on some of these campuses right now, that have for the first time populations of some size that they've never had before, that, they're opening doors for people behind them because they're doing so well. That will happen, I believe. And so I'm hopeful in that regard too, that once we get a sense of the contribution that can be made, we realize we honestly can't live without it.
Yeah. We found, so we've got a lot of alumni support for this initiative at Vassar, and often from alums that had not been connected to the institution for a long time. This was an issue they cared about, and they hadn't seen the college caring about this demographic. It also created some really nice synergies between the staff and town members and the college, because many of those staff members were either military themselves, veterans themselves, or a member of their family had been. So it created communities that crossed otherwise rather siloed groups on campus in really kind of a wonderful way. And then, absolutely, the faculty figured out that these students were incredibly interesting and made, certainly across a wide variety of departments, incredibly interesting classroom discussions. And the really interesting things was that the students figured it out, like our traditional students, like who were thinking about going into politics or the Foreign Service, like they just glommed onto these students and realized how much they could learn from just talking to them about their experiences. So it was great. So I think you're right. I think if we can get the door open to institutions, the veterans will make the case themselves. I do think we have to keep going back to those veterans and convincing them also that these places are right for them, and
Yes.
that they can truly benefit from attending them.
Yes, knocking down that barrier, that perception that they
Yeah.
can't do it. There's a quick story. A colleague of mine, a former colleague of mine, a rather senior colleague at the university, who had a child going to Columbia College, traditional student, very excited about the experience that their child was going through, and said, "What's the best part?" And the child said, "Well, you should see my classroom. I have a basketball player, an former NBA basketball player, and two veterans, and they're the most interesting students in the classroom." And one story, but I think sort of encapsulates what impact having people who've traveled different paths sitting next to you, sharing those experiences and influencing the discourse. I think that's it's a telling story. So I am also struck by there's an amazing number of really good partners out there, right? You talk about Posse, an amazing organization, and they've done great work bringing veterans to campuses across the U.S. Lots of nonprofits who are working hard to make this happen. This is sort of where CVTI sits. This is what we're interested in doing. It's partnering with those really good veteran service organizations and nonprofits and 2-year schools and 4-year schools, and figuring out how together we can make this work. But what is it you would share with higher ed professionals about working with partners like that? And are there lessons in any of that for us?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it is hard for any one institution to do this all on their own, and the smaller the institution, the harder it is. So it seems to me that there are, in fact, economies of scale as an economist from working with these intermediaries that are focused on this issue, and we should support them, and we should help them by actually admitting and matriculating veterans, because that's the other thing. If you go to a veteran and say, "Come to our institution, we really want you here," and he or she looks and in fact you have no veterans there, that's going to suggest that maybe this isn't a place for me. So I do think we have to get over this initial hurdle, and I think lots of these intermediaries can really help. And the work that you're doing on helping students think about appropriate places and helping administrators think about how to do it, I think is incredibly important.
Yeah. So now we have a moment where, and I don't mean to emphasize too much of the highly selective stuff, because I understand that's a really small piece of the larger conversation. But just for a moment, because I think it opens up a broader conversation, which I'd love to hear your thoughts on. It's the idea of an inclusive campus, and it's getting students in is one thing, and you touched on this earlier, and I do think this is probably conversation number 3, so maybe we're just doing a quick preview of that. But once you get the students in the door, how do you support them well, and how do you, it's the last part of the Center for Veteran Transition and Integration, this idea of integration. How do you ensure that they find their way in the community? And now we have a bunch of institutions who haven't had student veterans in any significant number, some of them since World War II. And now they have big populations again. And I know, because I went through this when we went from 40 students to 400 students in a 10-year period. There are things to think about. What advice do you have for institutions from where you sat when you went through that at Vassar? And you talked a little bit about this, but I'm really interested in hearing, what would you say to them to ensure success, or to make the conditions better for success of those students?
Yeah, so two things. One, part of the reason I think it's important that the more selective schools open their doors is that they have a lot of the support services that any student needs. And that's one of the reasons that the graduation rates are so high. So, that's important to begin with. And one of the things that's very important is to make sure that every student who walks through the door understands that all of those resources are for all of the students. So really interesting as we were trying to become more socioeconomically diverse, the high income kids knew they could go knock on the faculty's doors and go to office hours and go to the dean of freshmen and get help. The students that had come from less well-resourced high schools, saw that as something that was, you didn't do. So in the same way with veterans, I think if they come to these institutions, one message is, you belong here and all of these things are for everybody, including you. Now, the veterans will have some different needs. And what we found was asking them was really useful. Like we tried to anticipate everything, but we couldn't. And the other thing I want to say is don't wait to admit veterans until you think you have everything figured out, because you're never going to figure everything out. And so when they get to campus, just talk to them and find out what it is that they need. They were incredibly creative with us in articulating some of the things that they were having trouble with, and then suggesting solutions that we could implement to help. So I think that's important. And again, I think on these campuses and in our country right now and in our society, this notion that like everybody belongs and is part of the whole is a message that we have to convey better just about in every place we are working. And I think a college campus is a place, a university campus is a place where we can do it. And it's going to benefit the rest of our country if we can, in fact, show that you can bring people together from very different backgrounds and figure out a way to have a constructive community that engages with each other, learns from each other, and contributes to a better outcome for everybody.
Right. I don't think we can say it enough, and speak to this issue enough. Student veteran is very intentional, right? Veteran, student, veteran, student first. And that's not to diminish service. It's not to say we shouldn't provide specific support services to support veterans where they need it. But the idea that we say to our students, you are a student, or our veterans, you are a student now, like any other student, with the same access to all of the same things as any other student. And that's a responsibility on us as an institution to convey that. But it's also a responsibility on the students to comport themselves in that way and take advantage of it. Right. While we also think about those additional support services, whether it's navigating veteran benefits or whatever it may be that is specific to, to the student veteran. But this idea of integration is one we intentionally put on the end of the name of our center, and something that we have said for a long time at Columbia, that our philosophy is, you're here now and you were a student. We will celebrate your service, and there'll be all kinds of activities around what you've done and the fact that you are a veteran, but we want you to put on your student thinking now. We want you to think of yourself as a student. And I'll even say, there's a lot of talk out there around, lounges for veterans and spaces for veterans. And I think that's important conversation, but we've said to our students from the beginning here, the student lounge is your lounge. And that's where we want you to find your home, because part of what you're doing here is getting to know the other students, the students who are also non-traditional at Columbia General Studies, and the students who are at Columbia College and engineering and Barnard and all of the schools. And that's part of your experience here. And that's the push for integration, this idea that, we want you here because of who you are, not in spite of who you are, right. I think, in some ways. So I love how you speak to that. We have a lot of folks who work in higher education who are watching and listening. There's an opportunity for some questions. I see a few in the chat, and I'll try to bring a few forward. If others want to put a few in there, we can probably capture a few before we close down in the next few minutes. But Cappy, I just think, it feels like there's a particular moment for a call to action across higher ed. And I'm curious, is there a bit of advice that you think is bubbles to the top in all of this noise, that in this space that you would share to the admissions professional who's listening, or the dean of admissions, or even someone who held a role like you did as president?
Yeah, I just think the admissions staff and the leadership, the senior administration of these institutions, including the president and the boards, should just be saying, just do it. It's actually not that hard. You can do it.
Easy.
It'll take some effort, but there are, I think, a couple of million veterans out there who don't have a BA and who are eligible for the GI Bill. I think there's something like 5 million post 9/11 veterans out there. And that pipeline will be fed as more people leave the active military. And we should be letting them know that our doors are open and that they can benefit from coming. And it will benefit the students, it will benefit the institution. And not only the quality of the education that's being offered to all students, but it will help us in terms of the public perception of who we are and what we do and how we serve the public good. And it will help our country address these issues of just dealing with the amazingly wonderful but challenging diversity of our society.
Right. I love that thought. I would add to it with, the sort of just do it idea. If there's an admissions professional out there watching this and thinking about their own institution and how they can do this work. I was struck by something you said, small admissions team at Vassar, and you found a way. You figured something out. Columbia GS is a small team as well. And we had to be, thoughtful about where we could go and what we could do, but doing it was the key, and once we showed up, at a Camp Pendleton or Miramar Air Station or Camp Lejeune, and we're there in the education center, that was half of it, right? It was showing our willingness to put ourselves out there to say, come to a place like this by virtue of going there. That's not the only way to do it. There's lots of different ways to do it, but I couldn't agree more. That idea, just do it. It's the college presidents, it's the boards, and it's the people on the ground who have to just do it. So I love that. That's probably the perfect place to end. Unless you have any sort of closing thoughts. I hope we can get you back for more conversations at the Center for Veteran Transition Integration. You do amazing work. You're a wonderful colleague, and you have so much to offer and speak to. So just thank you for spending time with us and sharing your thoughts and being part of this conversation.
Well, again, I think Columbia's done a fantastic job. And so if there are people out there listening who want to figure out how to do this, come to both of us. We'd be happy to give additional thoughts on how to make it happen. But this is one that just feels like such a win-win-win for everybody that hopefully we can find a way to get that door open a little bit wider and get more veterans to walk through it and be in these great institutions. So.
That is the perfect place to end. Thank you, Cappy. Thank you for your time. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Look for our continuing conversations in the Supporting Student Success series, and we'll see you all again soon. Thanks.